May 21st, 1940, northern France. Afternoon light cuts through drifting smoke as a small column of British Matilda II tanks grinds forward, their engines rumbling like distant thunder. They are not fast, they are not graceful. They move with the heavy, deliberate determination of machines built for only one job: survive what comes next. In the fields ahead, German infantry and anti-tank crews catch sight of the advancing line. A few laugh, a few shake their heads. To them, the British tanks look like relics, too slow, too heavy, too outdated for a battlefield that had already been reshaped by blitzkrieg speed. The crews confidently swing their 37mm PaK-36 guns into position. They had spent months firing these weapons at French and Polish armor with perfect results. This would be no different. Or so they thought. The first German gunner fires. A sharp crack echoes across the field. The shell strikes the front of a Matilda II. Sparks burst outward, dust lifts from the armor, and nothing happens. No penetration, no smoke, no fire. The tank simply keeps moving. A second shot slams into the turret ring. Same result. Then a third. Panic begins to replace confidence. More German guns join in, the field alive with impact after impact, but the British tanks refuse to die. German crews frantically reload and fire again, their voices rising in disbelief. Inside the British tanks, the crews hear the constant metallic clanging of rounds bouncing off, like stones thrown at a steel door. One gunner mutters, half in awe, half in fear, that if he had been in any other tanks today, he'd be dead already. A British commander finally gives the order. The Matilda II's return fire. Their 2-pounder guns open up with sharp, controlled blasts tearing through German positions. Anti-tank crews scatter. Infantry break. Vehicles burn. The battlefield shifts in seconds as the toy tank the Germans had mocked suddenly becomes the most terrifying thing they had seen since the campaign began. In the German command sector, Erwin Rommel receives urgent reports of British armor punching through his lines. He orders the only weapons capable of stopping the Matilda II's 88mm flak guns to be dragged into ground roll and fired directly at the advancing tanks. It is the first time many of these guns are used against armor in this campaign. Nothing else works, nothing else can. This was the moment the myth of German invincibility cracked, even if only briefly. And this is the story of the slow, stubby British tank that Germany laughed at, right up until the day it walked through their best guns like they were made of cardboard. To understand why the Matilda II stunned the German army so completely, you have to go back to the years before the war, when Britain faced a problem no one had a simple answer to. German rearmament had transformed Europe. Fast armored divisions, tight coordination with air power, and highly mobile infantry made blitzkrieg feel unstoppable in practice. Every army watching Germany's early successes began to fear that speed was the true king of the battlefield. But Britain came from a different doctrinal tradition. They believed that infantry still needed tanks that could survive machine gun nests, artillery fragments, and anti-tank ambushes. This required armor, thick, heavy armor. Not something fast, but something that could not be easily killed. Most British tanks of the 1930s were lightly armored or lightly armed. They were designed around budget constraints and outdated assumptions. Against the rising threat of German armor and anti-tank guns, they stood little chance. British planners knew they needed something else, something that could protect infantry and stand firm under fire. And so, the concept of the infantry tank remained alive. Slow, heavily armored, and built to survive whatever came at it. Out of that philosophy, the Matilda II was born. It carried armor up to around 78 to 80mm thick across the front, astonishing for 1940. It was designed so that no common anti-tank gun of the era could reliably kill it from normal combat ranges. But there was a price. The tank was incredibly slow. It moved at a walking pace. Its twin diesel engines strained under the weight. Its interior was cramped and difficult for crews. Critics inside the British military hated it. German observers thought it was outdated before it even reached the battlefield. Military theorists of the time dismissed it as a relic of World War I thinking, too slow to exploit breakthroughs, too slow to retreat, too slow to matter. British tank crews training on the Matilda II initially agreed with the critics. They cursed its lack of speed. They cursed the mechanical layout that made maintenance a chore. They joked that infantry could march faster than the tank could drive. But their opinions changed the moment they watched live fire demonstrations. When they saw enemy-equivalent shells bounce off the armor without leaving more than a scorch mark, everything changed. They began to understand that this tank didn't need to be fast. It needed to be unstoppable, a moving fortress, not a racing machine. Meanwhile, the Germans were trapped in the comfort of early victories. Their Pak-36 anti-tank gun, the Door Knocker, worked flawlessly in Poland and in the early phases of the French campaign. It killed most Allied tanks without difficulty. German crews trusted it. German commanders trusted it. And no one on their side had any reason to believe the British possessed a tank that could ignore it completely. But they were wrong. They learned this in the fields around Arras, where the Matilda II took shot after shot, shrugged them off, and kept advancing. The Germans suddenly realized that their standard weapons were useless against this British tank. And when the British counterattack forced Rommel to deploy the deadly 88mm guns in a desperate attempt to stop them, the lesson was complete. The Matilda II was not a joke. It was not outdated. It was a battlefield problem that Germany had not prepared for. What made the Matilda II so hard to kill was brutally simple. Armor that early war German weapons could not pierce, combined with a high-velocity 2-pounder gun that could knock out German light armor and strongpoints at typical engagement ranges. It didn't need to be fast. It just needed to be alive when it got into position. When the Matilda II rolled into battle in 1940, it did exactly what it was built to do. The shock at Arras didn't simply come from the Matilda II's armor or the fact that German gunners found themselves firing uselessly at a tank they thought would fall quickly. The deeper shock came from what it represented, a tank that broke all the rules of early war thinking. In a world obsessed with mobility, Britain had quietly built something the Germans were not ready for, a machine designed to survive, not outrun the enemy. And in those critical hours, survival mattered more than speed. To understand why the German guns failed so miserably, it's important to look at the technical reality of early 1940. The standard German anti-tank weapon, the Pak-36, had earned a strong reputation against Polish and French armor. Against the Matilda II, though, it simply didn't have enough power. Its rounds struck the thick 80mm British armor at shallow angles, flattening or shattering upon impact. German crews tried firing at the turret ring, the side plates, even at the vision ports. Nothing worked. The shots sparked and ricocheted, leaving the tank unharmed. Some reports describe German gunners becoming visibly frustrated, even frightened, as the advancing Matilda tanks rolled closer and closer. Inside the Matilda IIs, the British crews were experiencing something rare on the early war Western Front: confidence. They felt the impacts as metallic thuds and ringing vibrations, but their armor held. They were protected. They pushed forward, firing their 2-pounders with precision. And for a moment, on a battlefield where Allied forces were being pushed back across a collapsing front, these tanks turned the momentum. German infantry units that had been advancing all morning suddenly found themselves retreating under the relentless approach of armored vehicles they could not stop. Rommel's quick decision to deploy 88mm flat guns in a ground roll was not just a tactical reaction, it was a sign of how seriously he viewed the threat. The 88mm gun was originally designed as a high-altitude anti-aircraft weapon. Its penetrating power was far beyond anything else available to German units in the area. By lowering the barrels and firing directly at the Matilda IIs, German crews finally managed to score clean penetrations. But the fact that Rommel had to call in such a massive weapon just to deal with a handful of British tanks showed how unexpected the Matilda's capabilities truly were.
Yet while Arras demonstrated the Matilda II's strengths, it also revealed the limitations Britain knew existed from the beginning. The tank was slow, painfully slow. It struggled on soft ground, and its engines strained over long distances. Its internal layout left little room for crew comfort or efficiency. Most critically, its main gun lacked a high-explosive shell at this stage of the war, making it less effective against unarmored targets and fortified positions. These drawbacks would grow more severe in the coming years, but in the spring of 1940, none of that diminished the tank's immediate battlefield impact. After France fell, the surviving Matilda IIs evacuated to Britain and were repaired, upgraded, and prepared for their next major test, North Africa. In the desert, the Matilda II once again proved its reputation as a near-impenetrable fortress. Against Italian forces whose tanks carried thin armor and whose anti-tank guns were weak by European standards, the Matilda II was almost untouchable. British tank units used it to spearhead assaults, break through defensive lines, and crush strong points that had resisted lighter vehicles. The tank earned a fearsome reputation, and Italian forces quickly learned to identify its distinctive silhouette and avoid direct confrontations whenever possible. But as the North African campaign escalated, the battlefield evolved. German forces arrived with stronger anti-tank guns, including the 50mm PaK 38 and later the 75mm PaK 40. These weapons were far more capable against Matilda armor, especially at shorter ranges or when firing specialized ammunition. The arrival of heavier German armor, such as the Panzer III with long-barreled guns, also reduced the Matilda's advantage. The British infantry tank that had once seemed invincible was slowly becoming outclassed by a new generation of weapons designed to punch through thick armor. Despite these challenges, the Matilda II remained valuable because of one trait that never failed: reliability under fire. Its armor still provided excellent protection in many engagements. Its mechanical systems, though slow, were dependable, and its 2-pounder gun, while limited, was accurate and deadly against lighter armored vehicles. British crews respected the machine for what it could do and learned to work around what it couldn't. The limitations of the design were always there, waiting to become more visible as the war progressed. The slow speed was a constant tactical burden. In the fast-moving desert battles of North Africa, Matilda units sometimes struggled to reposition quickly or exploit breakthroughs before enemy reserves could arrive. The cramped interior wore down crews during long operations, and the absence of a high-explosive round reduced its effectiveness in many combined arms situations. As German tactics adapted and stronger weapons became more common, the Matilda's early invincibility faded. But for a significant period at the start of the war, it was one of the most dangerous tanks in the world. The German reaction to the Matilda II, especially after Arras, was immediate and decisive. Reports circulated quickly through German armored units, warning that the British fielded tanks with armor too thick for standard weapons. The PaK 36, once considered reliable, was now viewed as inadequate. This shift in perception helped accelerate the development and deployment of more powerful anti-tank guns. The introduction of the long-barreled 50mm gun, the widespread use of the 88mm in dual roles, and eventually the deployment of the PaK 40 were all steps forward in German anti-tank doctrine, steps prompted in part by their encounters with early war British heavy armor. For Britain, the Matilda II was proof that a heavily armored infantry tank concept could work, even in an era dominated by fast maneuver warfare. The tank's role in delaying German forces during the retreat toward Dunkirk was especially significant. Every hour bought by armored counterattacks increased the number of Allied troops who could evacuate. In this sense, the Matilda II's presence on the battlefield had strategic consequences far beyond a single engagement. What gives the Matilda II its lasting legacy is not just its thick armor or early battlefield success, but the simple fact that it achieved what it was built to do: face the enemy head-on and survive. Its story is a reminder that sometimes the most unconventional designs, the ones people laugh at or dismiss, are the ones that prove themselves when it matters most. The Germans laughed at Britain's slowest tank until they saw it advancing through a hail of fire that should have stopped anything else on the field.
The Matilda II wasn't perfect, but it was exactly what Britain needed at a moment when survival was more important than speed. As the war progressed, the Matilda II continued to serve across multiple theaters, but the shift in battlefield technology gradually pushed it from the role of breakthrough tank to that of a dependable support vehicle. By late 1941 and into 1942, German and Italian anti-tank capabilities had evolved significantly. The introduction of the long 50mm guns on Panzer III tanks and the widespread deployment of the 75mm POC 40 finally gave Axis forces the tools to penetrate the Matilda's armor at combat distances. What had once been nearly immune to enemy fire was now vulnerable if caught in the open. Yet despite this, British crews still trusted the Matilda II because it had saved them too many times to ever dismiss lightly. In the desert battles of Operation Compass, Operation Battle Axe, and Operation Crusader, the Matilda II became both a symbol of British determination and a reminder of the changing nature of war. Crews drove these tanks through blazing heat, choking dust, and terrain that pushed every machine to its limits. Their slow speed made them predictable targets, but it also made them steady platforms for controlled, accurate fire. British infantry units grew accustomed to seeing Matildas grinding forward, taking punishment that would have destroyed lighter vehicles, and returning fire with calm, deliberate precision. The tank's armor gave infantry the confidence to advance and hold ground alongside it, forming tightly coordinated units that could break fortified lines or repel determined counterattacks. But as the Desert War grew faster and more mobile, the Matilda's greatest weakness became impossible to ignore. It simply could not keep pace with cruiser tanks or motorized formations. Battles would surge forward across kilometers of open desert, and the Matilda IIs would fall behind, miles away from the action. Its engines strained under the extreme heat, and its narrow tracks made it struggle in deep sand. Maintaining momentum in the desert required speed, flexibility, and rapid repositioning. Yet the Matilda II had been designed for a different kind of war, a slower, more methodical fight, where armor thickness mattered more than the ability to maneuver quickly. Despite these mounting challenges, the Matilda II remained relevant because of the tactical role it filled so well. Whenever the British expected to encounter strong defensive positions or heavily fortified strongpoints, Matilda units led the way. When infantry divisions needed armor that could survive the opening minutes of an assault, Matildas were placed at the front. When a position had to be held at all costs, commanders trusted Matilda crews to anchor the line. Even as newer tanks entered service, the Matilda II remained a vital asset wherever heavy armor was needed more than speed. German commanders, reflecting on their earlier encounters with the Matilda, recognized the importance of heavy armor long before it became widespread on the Eastern Front. The failures at Arras echoed through their analysis. They understood that an army relying solely on light, fast tanks would struggle once opponents fielded machines with thick armor and powerful guns. German tactical doctrine began to shift. Tanks like the Panzer III and Panzer IV received upgraded guns and improved armor. The infamous POC 40 became standard issue, and the use of 88mm guns as ground-based tank killers increased dramatically. All of these developments were shaped in part by the early encounters with British tanks like the Matilda II, encounters that exposed gaps in German firepower and forced rapid adaptation. As for the tank itself, its story during the mid-war years is one of gradual decline but continued usefulness. It served in smaller numbers in theaters like the Pacific and Burma, where the Japanese lacked the heavy guns needed to defeat it easily. In jungle environments, the Matilda's thick armor once again gave British and Commonwealth forces a dependable assault platform. In operations across New Guinea and Borneo, its ability to absorb fire and push through obstacles made it well-suited to dense terrain. Even in 1944 and 1945, when it was hopelessly outdated in Europe, the Matilda II remained a dangerous opponent in regions where the enemy lacked modern anti-tank weapons. But eventually, time caught up with the design. By the later stages of the war, new British tanks like the Churchill and the Cromwell had taken center stage. They offered stronger guns, better mobility, and more versatile roles. The Matilda II, once the shock of Arras and the spearhead of desert operations, became a vehicle primarily used in secondary roles or in theaters where its limitations mattered less. Yet, even then, crews respected it. They remembered the battles where it had saved them. They remembered the impacts of enemy fire bouncing harmlessly away. They remembered the strange feeling of being in a tank that opponents couldn't kill.
The legacy of the Matilda II is not defined by long service life or massive production numbers. It is defined by the moments where it mattered most. In the fields around Arras, where German gunners discovered their trusted weapons were useless. In the desert battles of North Africa, where it led assaults against fortified Italian positions. In the jungles of the Pacific, where its armor protected crews fighting in some of the most difficult terrain of the war. And in the memories of the soldiers who fought beside it, who watched it shrug off impacts that should have destroyed it, and who saw it complete missions other tanks could not survive. For Germany, the Matilda II became an early warning that Allied armor would not always be weak or outdated. It forced them to accelerate the development of stronger anti-tank guns and rethink how they approached armored warfare. For Britain, it was vindication, proof that their infantry tank concept had real value. And for the crews, it was a machine that represented something rare in 1940, a chance to stand and fight, even when outnumbered and outpaced. The German laughter that greeted the Matilda II on the battlefield of France did not last long. By the time the smoke cleared at Arras, the same tank that had been mocked for its speed and shape had crushed positions, survived fire, and forced the German army to scramble for heavier guns. It walked slowly, but it walked through weapons that should have stopped it, and in doing so, it earned a place in the history of British armor. They laughed at Britain's slowest tank until the day their best guns failed against it. The Matilda II's influence stretched far beyond its moments of battlefield dominance. Even as newer tanks replaced it, and as the pace of the war intensified, the lessons learned from its early performance shaped the development of British armored doctrine and influenced broader Allied thinking about what a tank needed to survive in modern warfare. The tank's thick armor, once mocked as excessive and outdated, had proven decisive when the Germans least expected it. In a conflict where speed and maneuver often stole the spotlight, the Matilda II reminded commanders that armor, real, dense, unyielding armor, still had a place in the evolving landscape of war. British engineers, reviewing the early analyses from France and North Africa, understood that the Matilda II's protection had saved countless lives. They noted how the tank's defensive design allowed crews to stay in the fight even when surrounded by enemy fire. This reinforced the British belief that armored vehicles did not always need to be fast. Some needed to be resilient, capable of advancing under fire and holding positions that lighter, faster machines could not. This philosophy carried forward into later designs like the Churchill tank, which prioritized thick armor and the ability to withstand direct hits over sheer speed. In this way, the Matilda II influenced later British heavy armor more deeply than many realize. The German side also absorbed critical lessons from encounters with the Matilda II. The shock of Arras and later the tank's tough performance in North Africa forced German engineers to confront their shortcomings of their early war anti-tank doctrine. The Pak-36, once deemed sufficient against most Allied armor, rapidly fell out of favor. German crews began referring to it as the Army's door knocker, a bitter acknowledgement of its inability to defeat heavily armored tanks. Commanders pushed for stronger weapons. Within months, the Pak-38 became more widespread, and shortly after, the deadly Pak-40 emerged, a gun that would become one of the most feared anti-tank weapons of the war. The necessity of adapting to tanks like the Matilda II helped accelerate this evolution. The impact on German tank design was just as significant. Armor thickness on later Panzer III and Panzer IV variants increased. Gun calibers improved. The harsh lesson delivered by the Matilda II that lightly armed tanks could be rendered ineffective by well-protected opponents echoed through the German design process.
And while these changes cannot be attributed solely to one British tank, the Matilda II played a measurable role in pushing German engineers towards more heavily armed and armored vehicles. It was an early signal that the arms race of tank versus gun was accelerating faster than expected.
While Europe and North Africa saw the most traumatic demonstrations of the Matilda II's abilities, its legacy expanded into distant theaters where outdated equipment was still effective. In the jungles of Southeast Asia, the Matilda II found a second life. Japanese forces, whose anti-tank weapons were far less powerful than those used by the Germans, struggled to stop the tank. Its heavy armor once again proved invaluable. British and Commonwealth forces deployed the Matilda II in operations where dense foliage, narrow paths, and fortified enemy positions required a tank that could take punishment while delivering accurate fire. In these environments, the Matilda II became a reliable spearhead, one that crews trusted to push through thick jungle and root out entrenched defenders. Throughout these varied campaigns, one truth remained consistent. The Matilda II earned the respect of the men who fought in it. Crew members recalled the confidence they felt inside its armored shell. They spoke of moments when enemy rounds hammered against the hull, only to leave shallow dents rather than deadly penetrations. They remembered the strong sense of security the tank gave them, even when advancing under concentrated fire. This emotional connection, formed in the heat of battle, is one of the clearest signs that the Matilda II succeeded in its mission. A tank is judged not only by its technical specifications or battlefield statistics, but by the trust it inspires in the men who operate it. And in this regard, the Matilda II stood tall. As newer tanks emerged in the British arsenal, the Matilda II gradually shifted to secondary roles. But its value remained clear even as it aged out of frontline service. Engineers studied its armor layout and internal structure to design better protection for future vehicles. Commanders used its combat record as proof that heavy armor had a role in combined arms warfare. And historians later recognized that although the Matilda II was not a breakthrough tank in the long term, it filled a critical role during a time when Britain desperately needed a machine that could stand firm. In evaluating its legacy, one must return to the early months of 1940. The British Expeditionary Force faced overwhelming odds. German divisions surged through France with relentless pressure. Allied armies were collapsing. Britain needed anything that could slow the German advance, disrupt their momentum, and buy time. The Matilda II did exactly that. Its performance at Arras surprised the Germans enough to force a cautious pause, and contributed to the window that allowed the evacuation at Dunkirk. Even if the tank's tactical success didn't alter the strategic outcome of the French campaign, the time it bought mattered. This is the essence of the Matilda II story. It was not a perfect tank. It was not a fast tank. It was not a tank built for sweeping maneuvers or for advanced armored warfare. But it was a tank built to survive heavy fire and continue fighting. And in the early years of World War II, that simple ability meant everything. The Germans laughed at it because they did not understand it. They saw a slow-moving vehicle that looked like an anachronism on a battlefield defined by speed. They expected it to die easily. When it did not, when it defied every expectation and walked through their best guns, those laughs vanished. The Matilda II stands as a reminder that, sometimes, the underestimated designs, the ones that appear outdated or clumsy, are the ones that make history. It is a reminder that technology measured on paper can look weak until it is tested under fire. And it is a reminder that machines built with a purpose, no matter how unfashionable, can change the course of events in ways no one predicts. In the end, the British Matilda II left its mark because it proved a simple truth. Armor matters, protection matters, and even the slowest tank on the field can become the strongest when the enemy's weapons fail. Its thick plates, steady advance, and surprising resilience gave Britain hope on days when hope was running out. That is why the Matilda II remains one of the most iconic infantry tanks of the early war. And that is why its enemies remembered it not with laughter, but with respect. As the war drew to its close, the Matilda II existed in a strange position within Britain's armored history. It was no longer the spearhead of major offensives.
It was no longer the unstoppable force it had been in 1940 or during the early desert battles. Better tanks now dominated the field, machines with heavier guns, improved mobility, and armor designed to withstand the late-war firepower that had become the new norm. Yet even in this twilight phase of its combat life, the Matilda II remained a symbol of something deeper, a reminder of a moment when a single tank design gave Britain the strength it needed at a time of desperate vulnerability.
The crews who had operated it carried those memories forward long after they transitioned to newer machines. They spoke of the Matilda's steadiness, its ability to take hits and keep moving, and the strange confidence that came from knowing you sat inside armor that early war enemies simply could not pierce. Veterans remembered the sound most vividly, the hollow thud of impact, the ring of metal, the knowledge that the shell had failed. Many described those first moments under German fire as surreal, almost disorienting, because tanks simply weren't supposed to survive direct hits. The Matilda II changed that expectation. It gave its crews the belief that they could close the distance, steady their nerves, and fight on through situations where any other tank would have been burning wreckage within seconds. Even enemy accounts eventually recognized what the tank represented. German after-action reports described unexpectedly thick armor and noted how standard weapons were ineffective at typical engagement ranges. Some units recorded how British tanks advanced despite significant fire, and how morale faltered when entire gun crews watched their rounds bounce without effect. For men trained to trust their weapons, this experience was more than tactically frustrating. It was psychologically destabilizing. In the early war, German troops were accustomed to being the ones with superior equipment. The Matilda II disrupted that sense of superiority in a way few Allied machines ever did. But the most lasting impact of the Matilda II is not found in the number of tanks it destroyed, the distances it traveled, or the campaigns it participated in. Its legacy lies in the strategic and doctrinal shifts it triggered. For Britain, the success of the Matilda reinforced the value of heavy armor at a time when many nations were abandoning it. Even as newer tanks evolved, the principle of survivability remained central. The idea that a tank should be able to withstand enemy fire long enough to deliver decisive blows informed British designs throughout the war. While later tanks balanced speed, firepower, and protection more evenly, the lesson of armor thickness, real armor that could save lives, never faded. For Germany, the Matilda II was one of the early signs that the rapid victories of 1939 and 1940 were not guaranteed in the future. Their rushed deployment of 88mm guns at Arras was not a coincidence, but a reaction born of necessity. German armored warfare would soon emphasize not only speed, which remained essential, but also the need for better guns and more versatile tanks. The Panzer III and IV models that followed reflected that balance. And when the Eastern Front opened, the lessons learned from fighting tanks like the Matilda II proved critical. German industry had to produce weapons capable of penetrating far thicker armor than anything encountered in 1940. The Pak-40, Tiger I, and Panther tanks were part of a continuous cycle of adaptation driven in small part by the shock delivered by early Allied heavy armor. By the end of the war, the Matilda II faded into the background as larger, deadlier, and more modern tanks took center stage. Yet even as British armored units transitioned to newer designs, the Matilda II remained in service in regions where its reliability and thick armor still mattered. In the jungles of the Pacific, its slow speed was less of a handicap, and its protection remained exceptional. In these dense, narrow landscapes, where ambushes were common and visibility limited, the Matilda's ability to absorb fire gave infantry a dependable vehicle to follow. It could push through barricades, survive anti-tank rifles, and deliver precise fire against fortified positions. In these late campaigns, the Matilda II once again demonstrated why armor, real armor, was something no commander could disregard. After the war, many of the tanks were scrapped or sold to friendly nations. A few remained in service into the early post-war years before finally being retired. Museums across Britain and the Commonwealth preserved several examples,
not because of their long-term battlefield dominance, but because of what they represented in the early days of the war. A rare moment when Britain's armored forces had something the enemy did not expect, could not counter, and did not understand until it was too late. Looking back at the Matilda II's story, it becomes clear why this tank still captures the imagination of historians and enthusiasts. Its design defied the trends of its time. Its performance challenged long-standing assumptions, and its battlefield debut delivered one of the most dramatic moments of early World War II, a moment when the German war machine, at the height of its momentum, was forced to stop and rethink everything it believed about British armor. It is rare for a single tank to change the rhythm of a campaign, rarer still for it to reshape the enemy's doctrine. The Matilda II did both. It is this combination of surprise, resilience, and impact that gives the Matilda II its enduring place in history. When the Germans first saw it rolling slowly toward their lines, they laughed. They saw a tank that looked clumsy, old-fashioned, and out of touch with the realities of modern warfare. Yet within minutes, those same soldiers watched their weapons fail. Within hours, their commanders scrambled to bring forward heavier guns. Within days, German analysts were writing reports questioning whether their anti-tank capabilities were enough for the battles ahead. This transformation, from mockery to respect, is what defines the Matilda II. It is a story of underestimation, adaptation, and the brutal honesty of combat. War reveals what works and what doesn't, stripping away theory and exposing truth. And the truth in 1940 was simple. Britain had built a tank that could take everything the Germans threw at it and keep moving. In the final measure, the Matilda II's victories were not just tactical, they were symbolic. They showed that Britain, even in its darkest hour, possessed engineers who could create machines that fought above their weight. They showed that British armored doctrine, though different from German thinking, still had value. And they showed that courage, armor, and determination could challenge even the most confident enemy. The Germans laughed at the Matilda II until the day their best guns failed. And when the echoes of those failed shots faded across the fields of Arras, the tank they mocked became the tank they remembered.